the employers who are the most enlightened, meaning they give people flexibility and control over the work that they do. They minimize pay for performance. All this stuff that is the antithesis of the mainstream model, these companies are the most profitable, productive companies in their industry for virtually every industry. So the question that then arises is, in the face of this overwhelming evidence that there are better ways to organize work, why are so many people who run companies leaving money on the table?
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Today I'm speaking with Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz was previously Dorwin Cartwright Professor of Social Theory and Social Action in the Psychology Department at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, where he taught for 30 years. More recently, he's been teaching at the Haas Business School at the University of California, Berkeley. Barry's the author of Why We Work, Practical Wisdom, and The Paradox of Choice. He's also the author of several textbooks on the psychology of learning and memory, including The Battle for Human Nature, Science, Morality, and Modern Life. Barry's articles have been published in the New York Times, USA Today, Slate, Scientific American, Harvard Business Review, The Guardian, and others. He's also appeared on dozens of radio shows, including Morning Edition, Talk of the Nation, Anderson Cooper 360, and CBS Sunday Morning. Barry is perhaps the perfect guest for Work for Humans. His work is a deep exploration of the traits that can make work feel meaningful, which is right up our alley here on the show. In this episode, Barry and I talk about why the pay-for-performance model doesn't work. We discuss what people really want from their work, how a lack of autonomy can be seen as a cost of employment, and we discuss how companies can build workplaces where employees are motivated, innovative, and happy. All right, without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz, welcome to Work for Humans. I've been wanting to talk to you for a very, very long time. I have read, I think, every book that you've written. I've read Practical Wisdom and Paradox of Choice and Why We Work. Today we're going to talk a lot about why we work, but I think we'll probably circle around to those others.
Excellent. I'm honored that you've taken the trouble to read the things I write.
Not only have I read them, I've read them and I've kept them in my head for years. So yeah, no, they've really been important to me.
Thank you.
How did you arrive at writing Why We Work?
Well, that turns out to be something of a long story, but we have time. I started my career half a century ago as a student of the research of B.F. Skinner. Skinner at that time was probably the most prominent psychologist alive. Since then, his influence has waned, and many of your listeners may not even have heard of him. But this was the guy who studied rats pressing bars for food and pigeons pecking lit discs for food. And his idea was that if you want to understand human behavior, you have to understand the consequences of action. Behavior is controlled by consequences. Rewards make what we did to get them more likely. Punishments make what we did to get them less likely. And if you understand that, you understand everything. And since the principles of this sort of voluntary goal-directed behavior are universal, you can see how rats are affected and pigeons are affected, and from that generalize to all species. So that was the tradition within which I got my start. And my aim was basically to show that this was a false view, that it explained some things, but it didn't explain very much. And it particularly didn't explain very much when you got to humans. And the reason I had that feeling is that it didn't seem to describe me. It didn't seem to describe the people I knew. It didn't seem to describe my teachers. And so how could this general universal theory be promulgated that doesn't seem to fit anybody in my life? So I thought that the trick was to come up with empirical evidence for why it was wrong, why it was faulty, why it was incomplete. Happily, I taught at a place called Swarthmore College, small liberal arts college, and I spent a lot of time with people outside of psychology, with economists, with philosophers, with historians. And they essentially gave me an education in sort of the assumptions of economics and the pattern of industrial history that I had essentially missed during my undergraduate and my graduate career. And what I came to see was that what Skinner was basically, he was the psychologist of capitalism. And more specifically, he was the psychologist of assembly line production. You putting people in factories pressing clothing is basically the same as putting rats in boxes pressing levers. You ask yourself, why would anyone go to work in a factory pressing pants 8 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, over and over and over again forever? And the answer is the only reason anyone would possibly do that is for the payoff. Why else? And in effect, what he had done is create in the laboratory a little mini factory where the only reason the rat would do anything is to get food. And from that, generalize to the belief that that explains all of human behavior. And Adam Smith in the 18th century talked about the virtues of the division of labor, how much more productive factories are if you take tasks and divide them up among people so that each person is doing the same thing over and over and over again. And for Smith, this was not an issue because he thought people are basically lazy. People work for pay. And if you pay them, it doesn't matter what they do. So why not have them do things that will increase the efficiency of production? So that idea has been a part of our thinking in designing economic institutions and production institutions, designing how classrooms operate for 200 years. And it's false.
I'll tell you why this discussion is so interesting to me is that, first of all, I've come to distrust psychologists. And the reason I've come to distrust them in business, and particularly IO, industrial and organizational psychologists, is because my whole industry of human resources is based upon carrots and sticks.
Yep.
And so, for instance, we use the phrase pay for performance. And we have the idea that if you don't live up to a specific job description, that you're going to be not rewarded for that, or you will be rewarded for that. I haven't bought it for years, although I will tell you that in the beginning, I did buy it. And I'm a recovering, I guess, Skinnerist or whatever you'd call that. So how'd we get it wrong?
Well, the book Why We Work tries to answer that question and introduces a concept that I borrowed from Karl Marx, Groucho's older brother, a concept that he referred to as ideology. Ideology is a word that we use routinely, but Marx used it in a particular way. For Marx, ideology was a kind of consciousness, a framework for understanding, but it was false. And so ideology was false consciousness, a view of the world that can govern the shape of institutions, the shape of your own decisions, that is based on a false understanding of reality. What I try to suggest in the book, Why We Work, is if you believe, as Adam Smith said and Skinner said, that people just do it for pay, and you then create workplaces that essentially exclude any other reason for being there except for pay, and then you put people in those workplaces, and lo and behold, they work fast, they work hard, they work productively. What do you conclude? You conclude that Adam Smith's theory was true. That's the wrong conclusion. The right conclusion is if you create a world that's like a Skinner box, people will behave like rats and pigeons. But what if you created a different world? And so you can see what happens. Smith says this, the scientific management movement, which began in the early 20th century, went around doing time and motion studies in factories to turn people into, as much as possible, into extensions of machines. And you had this explosion of productivity, and everyone could say, see, we took advantage of basic principles of psychology and created workplaces that capitalize on those basic principles. And as long as you get the pay right, nothing else matters. And we can put people in these Skinner boxes and they will be productive because people work for pay. That's 100 years ago. But what's happened, in part owing to that impact and the explosion of assembly line work all over the place, and in part owing precisely to what you just described, all these psychologically sophisticated people who come to organize work in workplaces, what are they going to do? They're going to replicate the conditions that they learned were the key conditions for productive work. And before you know it, wherever you look, all you've got is people who are sort of in situations like the Skinner box, working their asses off for a paycheck and indifferent to the conditions of their labor. So I think it's not surprising that you started out in your field with that attitude, because that was the universal attitude. And it was just not true. But if in a certain environment, it becomes true. If you create an environment, and this was Marx's point, if you create an environment in which, for example, people are alienated from their labor, they have no reason to be doing the work that they do except for the pay, and someone else is telling them what work to do and how to do it. If you create a world where that's the way life is, then sure enough, people are going to look just like the rats and pigeons that Skinner studied. And so it became self-perpetuating.
So I have two questions about that. So what's wrong with that? I mean, if it's productive, right?
Yeah.
If I'm a CEO and I'm looking at my company and that's working, in other words, why would I change?
Two things. There are two answers to that. One, the organization, OB scholar Jeffrey Pfeffer, who teaches at Stanford, your neck of the woods, has written a book, The Human Equation. Jeffrey Pfeffer, Pfeffer. And in the book, it's 20 years old now, he shows consistently in industry after industry that the employers who are the most enlightened, meaning they give people flexibility and control over the work that they do, they minimize pay for performance. If the company's doing well, we all do well. If the company's doing badly, we all do badly. That kind of thing. We're all in this together. A whole bunch of stuff. Lots and lots of training, because you expect the people who work for you essentially to be irreplaceable. All this stuff that is the antithesis of the mainstream model. These companies are the most profitable, productive companies in their industry for virtually every industry. So the question, why not do it because it works, is, yeah, it works, but there are other ways that work a lot better. And let me just say, this creates its own mystery. Capitalists aren't supposed to be leaving money on the table. So the question that then arises is, in the face of this overwhelming evidence that there are better ways to organize work, why are so many people who run companies leaving money on the table? Why isn't every manager an enlightened manager? They could do better. Why aren't they taking advantage of this? It's not rocket science. It's not a secret. So that's its own puzzle. Second thing is that Gallup surveys workplace satisfaction every year all over the world. And what they basically find is that roughly 10% of people who work are enthusiastic about the work they do. About 60% are unenthusiastic, and the rest positively hate it. In other words, we spend half of our waking lives doing work we don't want to do in a place where we don't want to be. And whether it costs the company money, it certainly costs society money to be forcing people to spend half their waking lives doing stuff they loathe, especially if it's not necessary. So if you're looking at value added and you include value added for the employee, there is no value added for the employee except for the pay and benefits. And everything else is value subtracted. So those are two answers. One, if you have an enlightened workplace, you actually are more profitable. And two, we're destroying the capacity of human beings to do good things.
I'll tell you something about that first point. Why would anybody leave money on the table? Businesses go out of business all the time. And we often don't know what it is that made them go out of business. They took a wrong decision. Well, who makes decisions in the companies? People. Basically, there's a survivor bias, which is you look at people who are here, some of them are budding failures.
Yep.
And it may be because of how they're treating their people, which is if the people are no longer helping them to make good decisions, someday they're going to end up in a place where it looks like a business problem, but it was actually a people problem.
You know, it's interesting because what was that book that Peters wrote? Great Companies to Work For. It's a huge bestseller. And virtually all the companies he singled out went bust. So I think it's exactly a survivor's problem. You take a snapshot, you see who's successful, And then you interpret the success, over interpret the success when it's basically just coin flips. And 5 years later, they're going to be gone. And interestingly, one of the people that Pfeffer takes on specifically is a guy named Jack Welch, very famous as the CEO of General Electric. And he turned GE from basically a home appliance company into this megalith that did everything. And most of its revenue came from finance at some point. And he was a lean and mean kind of guy. He was the guy who had the view you evaluate every employee and you fire the bottom 10%, no matter how good they are. You replace the bottom 10% and you just keep doing that. So this sort of myth of a model of the tough leader was embodied by him. The company exploded. He had his moment in the sun, and a lot of people interpreted his success, the company's success, as a vindication of his management style. Well, almost certainly not true, but it can cast a shadow that lasts a very long time as new people start new companies and cast about wondering, I had an idea, but I don't know how to run a company. What should I do? Oh, I know. I'll do it the way Jack Welch does it. So I think you're right. It's companies are people. People get their ideas from things like MBA programs and their undergraduate training and the people who brought them up in the organization. And if those ideas are flawed, the practices that these people adopt are also going to be flawed. Not necessarily flawed catastrophically so that it becomes obvious that you're doing something wrong, just flawed in that everyone says TGIF on Friday. People work only as hard as they're forced to work by somebody looking over their shoulder. They cut corners whenever they think they can get away with it. If they have ideas about improving the process, they keep them to themselves because there's nothing in it for them. There's no investment in the welfare of the company. And you're doing okay. You're making payroll. The shares are going up slowly. So why would you change?
Yeah. And then there's a downturn and you're gone.
There's a downturn and you're gone because there's nobody with an investment. I mean, the only people with an investment are the people who own shares, not the people who work in the company. And you want the people who work in the company to be the ones with the investment.
So this is the place I really want to get into. So what do people want from work?
So I think that make one thing absolutely clear. People need a paycheck. Nobody works without getting paid. I mean, virtually nobody works without getting paid. So people need to get paid.
Can I make a point on that? Which is, in reading Why We Work, I had this one nit as I was reading it. And it's actually not in the book. It's just slightly implied. And I hear it, which is people want more than money. And so that can become the idea that money's not important, or the implication that money's not important, or that money is the same as avarice, which is people want a new TV, but actually there's something much more humanist that they want. My experience interviewing people is that what they want from money is to take care of their family.
Yep.
It's not avarice. It is absolutely something that needs to be there. And it's not that we can say that they want more than money, but we don't want to say they want just money.
I think that's absolutely right. For most people, it's really about security, not hedonism. And there's a reason for this. And this will probably vary from one culture to another. The United States, whatever its admirable attributes, is essentially a society in which we are taught it's every person for himself. You want your kids to go to college? Make money so you can pay for college. You want to have decent health care? Make money so you can pay incredibly expensive insurance bills or doctor bills. We are on our own. And so the question that one might ask, if the state's not going to make sure that if the worst happens, I'm okay, how much is enough? And the truth is, and the explosion of housing costs in where you and I live has certainly made that clear. The truth is that no matter how much you have, it probably isn't enough. If what's at stake is the education of your children and being able to live in a decent community, and housing prices are going up 25% a year, and college tuitions are going up 25% a year. You know, when I went to college, it cost me $1,000 a year to go to college at one of the most expensive schools in the country. I think it's now $70,000 a year to go to those schools. So how much is enough? You have 3 kids. Each kid's going to cost you $250,000. Who thought like that? If you put people in a situation like that, it looks like it's just greed and hedonism, but it isn't. It costs a lot of money to take care of your family because the state's not doing its part. At least that's my view. And so if you went to Scandinavian countries with much, much more developed and generous safety nets, I suspect you'd find fewer people taking this job rather than that one because it pays a little more. Because that would only be for hedonistic reasons, since all of the really fundamental stuff is taken care of. So we've created an environment in which everyone looks greedy because that's the only way to succeed in this society.
So what is there, let's say, beyond the money?
Beyond. People want to actually like what they do. They want to be engaged by it. They don't want to mail it in. They want to put a lot of themselves into it. They want rich relations with coworkers. The social context of the work matters. They want to learn. They want to develop. They want to get better at whatever it is they do and to do new things. They want a measure of autonomy and control over the work process, which is not to say that people go to a job thinking that they can tell the company what the goals of the company should be. But people do take jobs thinking that they're going to have something to say about how those goals get realized, that they're going to have scripts to follow. They're not going to have somebody looking over their shoulder. Their training, expertise, and commitment are going to be exploited, taken advantage of, and they're going to be given a lot of flexibility in how the work gets done. And what I think is most important is people want to feel like what they do has meaning, that it makes a difference. Now, the word meaning is itself a little vague. Meaning doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. For me, a first approximation that captures most of what people mean when they talk about meaning is that the work improves other people's lives in some way. Doesn't have to be a big way, doesn't have to be cardiovascular surgery. But I'll just to illustrate this, think about retail, shopping mall. What could be worse than a job in a shopping mall selling stuff people don't need to people who probably can't afford it? Suppose when you get hired for a retail job, the expectation is and the understanding is that your job is to sell as much of this crap as you possibly can. That's why you're there. But suppose that instead you had a different view. Everybody who comes into the shop has a problem. Your job is to help people solve problems. You know what you've got. You know what your inventory does, what's good, what's less good, what's good for this problem, what's good for that problem. Well, imagine like a hardware store. Somebody comes in and something's not working and they can't even name the part that's not working, but you are there to solve people's problems. And 100, 200, 500 people a day come in with small problems. And if you do your job well, they go out without those problems. It's a terrific way to live your life, thinking that you're improving the lives of 500 people every day. Who gets that kind of training in doing retail? Nobody, I bet.
It's interesting. You mentioned in the book the term positive sum.
Yeah.
Can you describe that term?
It's interesting. So there are 2 broad models about how to approach any kind of negotiation. And you could view your entry into a retail shop as the beginning of a negotiation. I want to buy this stuff. You want to sell me that stuff. We're going to negotiate both about what I buy and how much I pay for. Okay. So the presumption for a lot of people is that these kinds of interactions are zero sum, which is to say, everything I gain from this interaction, you lose. There's a certain amount of value. And the more I can extract, the less you extract. And so there's a kind of competition. You know, in football, it's a zero-sum game. There's one winner and there's one loser. The more points I score, the less likely you are to win. That's the nature of games. But it isn't the nature of life. But we seem to go around with the attitude that it is the nature of life. And here's another example of ideology. A fundamental principle of market economics is that the only reason trades happen, the only reason exchanges happen, the only reason when I bring my potatoes to the market to trade them for your oranges, the only reason those trades happen is that we both benefit. Why would I bother trading with you if I end up even? And so the oranges you have are worth more to me than they are to you. The potatoes I have are worth more to you than they are to me. And so trading a sack of potatoes for a sack of oranges makes both of us better off. That is the essential understanding of why transactions happen. And they wouldn't happen unless that was true. So this is a deep, deep principle of free market organization. And we have essentially forgotten. And instead, we view every transaction as a competition that'll have a winner and a loser rather than two winners. And so thinking about these sorts of activities as positive sum and asking, how can we go through this process of negotiation so that we both reap benefits from the agreement that we reach, just changes everything.
In particular, if I'm working in that retail store, the value that I'm giving to somebody, the help that I'm giving to them is the positive sum.
That's correct.
And every transaction, every bit of work that we do that is profitable is partially profitable because the positive sum exists.
That's one way of looking at it. But, think about this. If your aim is just to sell as much stuff as you possibly can, you're going to try to upsell everybody. And you're not going to be interested in solving this person's problem. You're going to be interested in solving your problem, which is to make whatever quota your manager has given you. And so what you're going to end up doing is sending people out unhappy. They're not going to be unhappy immediately, but then they're going to get home and they're going to realize that this piece of technology that they bought that's got a million bells and whistles, they'll never figure out how to use it. So it just goes into their closet in the box, unopened, or that it has features that they're never going to use. So they paid more than they needed to, and they're going to be pissed off at you. And so you extract more surplus from them, but they get less than they would if instead you viewed each person who comes into the store as somebody with a problem, and your job was to solve it, even if it meant underselling rather than overselling. Who does that? There is a company that does that. Let me just say, every mall on the planet, it's a place called the Container Store. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It basically just sells pieces of plastic that people can use to store all the stuff they buy that they don't actually need. So that's what it does, sells containers. But you go in there, and the attitude, in my experience, in several different stores, they're all over the place, with many different employees, they are never trying to sell you more than you need. Their view is this person has a problem and I'm going to help this person solve it. And sometimes that's going to mean sending them out with nothing, or sending him out with less than he came in looking for, because there's this thing we have he doesn't know about that will do the job and cost a third as much. So the attitude of the employees is like no retail store I've ever been in. I mean, they are just so enthusiastic. I don't know what their pay structure is like, but I can't help but think it's because they know that at the end of the day, they've made 100 people's lives better.
So now we're going to get into something I think is super, super interesting. That's the approach that I've been taking to work.
Yeah.
Which is, I've been asking people, so it's a marketing principle. It was promoted by Clay Christensen, but I think it predated him. And I think it was Theodore Levitt at Harvard who first said, people don't want to buy a 1/4-inch drill. They want to buy a 1/4-inch hole. And he said, so if you ask people, help me to design this drill, they'll say, well, it needs to have a little trigger that turns it on and off. But if you ask them, what do you want to do with that drill? And they say, I want to get a 1/4-inch hole. You say, well, if it does the 1/4-inch hole without the little trigger, would that be okay? And they say, yeah, that would be great. I don't care about the trigger. You say, if it has the little trigger, but it doesn't drill the hole, would that be okay? And they say, no. And so by looking at what people really want to do with the thing that they're buying, for a while now, I've been positioning work as a product that people buy. And I've been using marketing concepts to explore what it is that they want from work. And I think that those marketing concepts are actually different from some of the approaches that have been used by psychologists to understand what people want from work. So what I've been getting is a Venn diagram. I get many of the answers that I heard you just say, but I also get a different set of answers, and there's a few things that are missing. And so I'd love to explore the methodology that's been used by psychologists to reach this richer understanding of work. I'd love to explore the difference. And I'll just give you a couple of examples from my research. So when I ask people, The theory that I was talking about is job to be done theory, which is you say, what job do you want to get done with that drill? So I've been asking, what job do you hire your job to do for you? I get answers like, I hire it to learn. I hire it to help others. And people say it, I hire my job to make a difference. And you say, like, what kind of difference do you want to, like, maybe pollute more? And they say, no, that's not what I want to do. I want to make people healthy, or I want to do something good for people. I want to get paid. And you ask them, why do you want to get paid? And they say, I want to take care of my family. Or sometimes they say, I want to buy other experiences. I want to dine out occasionally or something like that. But then you get these things that I think are a little bit more, they're almost like tactical needs of work. One person said, I hire my job to pretend. And I said, what do you mean pretend? And he says, I like to go to work and I like to pretend that I'm a vice president. I said to him, you are a vice president. You're a vice president at a Fortune 50 company. He says, no, I'm a jazz musician. He says, but I play a vice president at work. I get to put on my vice president costume and I get to get on stage and I get the lights and I get an adoring audience. And he says, I learned as a jazz musician that that's what I wanted. And turns out a lot of people want that. Some people say, I hire my job to escape my home life. Some people say, I hire my job to give me a worthy opponent. And so I've gotten a set of answers. Here's one of my questions. One possibility is my method's different. It's coming up with things, could be right, could be wrong. Another possibility is that what's happened is psychologists have encountered those through their methods, but have simplified it to package up an idea in a way that it can be consumed. So my first question is, how did we learn this about what people want from work?
By asking them. But I think you're right about packaging things so that they can be consumed. If you ask them in open-ended interviews and you don't try to pigeonhole the answers into pre-existing categories, you're going to have a hell of a time making sense of what people tell you. There are, as the TV show used to say, there are 8 million stories in the naked city. Everybody's different. And if you let people talk and honor what they say instead of transposing it, as I say, you're going to come up with accounts that don't fit. So that's not what psychologists do, because you're trying to come up with generalizations that have some power. So the things that I mentioned to you are the product of either of interviews that then get coded to fit into existing conceptual categories, or questionnaire type things where you're basically forcing people to tell you not what they want, but you're giving them a set of things they might want and asking them how important they are. So one thing, for example, would be recognition. People want recognition. This is your jazz musician. I want recognition. And it's really hard to get recognition as a jazz musician, but as the CEO of a Fortune 50 company, everybody wants to kiss my ring. And I can't tell you how good that feels. That's fine. Now, there's an acknowledgement in the field that people care about recognition. There are very few of us who are happy to work in complete obscurity, knowing at the end of the day that we've done what we're supposed to do and made life better or made the organization better, but nobody knows it. Now, they don't necessarily need the recognition to come in the form of a bonus or a promotion or a raise, but they want some indication that people appreciate and value what they do. So, an elementary school teacher, no doubt, gets enormous joy and satisfaction out of the enthusiasm that her pupils show and the kudos that she gets from the parents of these pupils. He was never interested in reading, and all of a sudden, all he wants to do is sit on a couch and read one book after another. You hear that stuff, and from fellow teachers and from principals who pat them on the back and say, you're doing a hell of a job. That matters. But we have a category for that. There's still going to be people like your CEO who says, I'm a jazz musician pretending to be a CEO who poses a real challenge for our categories. Wanting to escape from my home life. That probably doesn't make it onto most people's lists of explanations for why people work. There are, after all, think about it, there are many different ways to get away from your home life, one of which is a job, and there are many jobs. So why this job? So there's a sense in which it doesn't really explain why this person is working at Google rather than at the Container Store. You need more to explain that.
I think that's right. I like that. First of all, the point that we're striving for generalizations, and we're striving for the generalizations that we can bring up to a high enough level of abstraction that they explain a lot of behavior. And so we do two things. One is we collect things into larger buckets, and then we find out which of those buckets are actually driving the most behavior, or at least people report they drive their behavior. Where I am in my role is that I need to design work. And the closer I get to generalizations, the farther I get away sometimes from design attributes.
Yeah.
And the way I started to think about it is I've identified maybe 30 different answers to the question about what people hire their job to do for them. And then a handful of others that seem to be sort of cross-cutting across all of them. One of the ones you said was recognition. There's this cross-cutting idea across a lot of the reporters that they need some way to detect that what they did made a difference. Whether it was, I built a house and now I can point at the house, or whether I helped somebody and they said, thank you.
But notice, let me just interrupt you.
Yeah, please.
The recognition is one way of what you're talking about is feedback. Did I actually do what I was trying to do? Did I achieve the desired result? You can get that without formal recognition and a pat on the head. You have evidence. This kid is reading all the time. As soon as this kid comes into the classroom in the morning, he runs straight to the bookshelf, takes out a book and starts reading. And you know that this kid was not doing that at the start of the school year. So you've got the feedback. Now, I'm not saying that's enough. I think people want more than just evidence that what they're doing is effective. They want some evidence that the world realizes that they're good at what they do. That matters also. But there are ways to give feedback that's just between you and the activity, and no one else needs to know about it.
An interesting thing happened, which is my wife is a teacher. And so through the pandemic, all of a sudden she was piping her lessons into people's houses virtually.
Yeah.
Incredibly hard for that profession. Incredibly hard. And in fact, the profession's in real trouble because people have seen what happened and they're not actually signing up for credentialing programs. At like 50%, it's very serious. But one of the good things that happened is that a whole generation of parents got to see teachers at work. And my wife has gotten a level of recognition for that from families that she never had a chance to get before, because all of a sudden they got to see her be a genius, which she is. And so it's an interesting byproduct of the pandemic.
It's an interesting question. In various big cities around the country, during the early days of the pandemic, there would be the 7 p.m. open your window and give a standing ovation to the frontline workers, healthcare workers, but also people who stocked grocery shelves and delivered things and all that stuff. So the question with these essential workers and your wife, this dopamine hit of recognition, and how long will it last? I was not optimistic that as the crisis moments early in the pandemic faded, that our appreciation for the invisible people who made our lives possible would linger. The fact that all of a sudden what's happened in the latter days of COVID is people fighting with all these people because they insist that they wear their damn masks instead of applauding them, taking risks. And I'm judging from what's now going on in fights between parents and schools about what's in the curriculum. I have a feeling that your wife experienced a brief moment of ecstasy that is also not going to last. I also taught remotely during COVID, and I taught grown-ups. I hated it.
Yeah.
And I've been doing it for a long time, but I just found it impossible to read whether I was inspiring people, boring them to death, whether they were understanding me. It was just, I didn't realize how much I depended on subtle feedback from nonverbal cues that you get when you're, sort of scanning a room. I hated it. I said to people, if we're doing it again this year, I'm not going to teach. And luckily, they went back to in-person learning after the first couple of weeks of the semester. I'd find a different profession. Luckily, I don't have to worry about that since I'm sort of at the end of the line. But I appreciate how impossibly difficult it was to do your wife's job. What age kids does she teach?
Well, kindergarten is where she started.
That's just impossible.
It was unbelievable. And in fact, in some cases, had to send technology home to families where nobody was literate in any language.
Ugh.
So nobody could read any language. And this was a step from that to this. And she did it successfully.
It is a miracle.
It is.
And I'm glad she got this little hit of recognition, and I hope it lasts.
So let me see if there's anything else about this sort of Venn diagram that I want to get into. The Venn diagram between what I find in my research and what I hear in the research. One of them is when I ask people what job they hire their job to do for them, nobody has ever said, I hire my job to give me autonomy. I think I know why that is. At least I have a hypothesis I want to try with you, which is, one is, if people were hiring something to give them autonomy, it would be unemployment. In other words, I think the lack of autonomy is one of the costs of employment. And so nobody ever says, I hire my car to pay $30,000. The $30,000 is a part of the cost. So that's one. And the other thing I think is I might not be listening to the verbs in what they say back to me, which is they say, I hire my job to let me make a difference. And so if there's this idea of let in there, that might be the autonomy that they're looking for.
I think the problem is that autonomy is too abstract. People don't expect to tell their employers what the goal of the enterprise should be. I know you make software to help people do their taxes, but I want to help people make the biggest charitable contributions every year that they possibly can. And so that's what I'm going to do when I take this job. You have a different goal. That's your business. My goal is to encourage philanthropy. So that's what I'm going to do. Nobody expects when you hire on for a job that you get to say what the goal is. The company's goal and your goal, if they align, that's fabulous. But only in America can people possibly be narcissistic enough to think that they get to impose their goal on their employer. But people want to be respected and trusted to figure out how to achieve the goals that their employer has made explicit and that they have signed on to because they've accepted employment. Trust me. Don't treat me like an idiot. Don't treat me like a shirker. Assume that just like you, I want to do the best job I possibly can. And then let me take advantage of my skills, my training, my ability to read individual clients and make decisions about how best to achieve that. And so that's the level, I think, at which autonomy matters. And people might not describe it as autonomy. They might describe it as wanting to be trusted and respected by their supervisors. Now, you say, well, what does it mean to be trusted and respected? Trusted and respected as a human being? Well, no, I want them to let me do my job. I don't want them micromanaging. And you see this. There's a wonderful example. And this is really all about what the wisdom book is about. Because what we argue in that book is that rules are no substitute for judgment. In most of the work people do, judgment is required. And if you think that you can overcome lack of judgment or bad judgment by adding rules, you're kidding yourself. Rules are insurance policies against disaster, but they don't get us excellence. They don't get us what we want. And the first thing we reach for whenever something goes wrong is another rule so that that particular thing won't go wrong again. And slowly over years, you end up taking all the room for judgment out of the work that people do. There's a great example of this. So this happened during the Iraq War. The Army was concerned that the field commanders, the people who actually commanded troops in combat, were inflexible. And the result is that, especially in the kind of asymmetric warfare that characterizes the modern conflict, judgment is required. You encounter a novel situation all the time, and you need to figure out how to do how to improvise. It's a kind of jazz. You need to be a jazz musician. And why weren't there field commanders doing this? They got somebody to study the problem. And this person came back with the following conclusion. He asked, Where do field commanders develop this judgment? Now, they partly learn it on the battlefield, but that's kind of risky. People are going to be dead while you're getting smarter. But they also learn it in training their troops. And the reason they learn it in training their troops is that they're given a small number of goals for the training, and then it's up to them to figure out how to achieve those goals. So there's an enormous amount of improvisation, flexibility, designing exercises to fit the particular people you're trying to train, and so on, that goes on in relative safety during the training and before they're in combat. And what the Army did over the years is they replaced this flexibility with a set of scripts. These are, instead of having 7 or 8 objectives, there are now 200 objectives, and there is a specific way to achieve each objective. And so now you've completely de-skilled the training process. You're just going through scripts that have been handed to you by the top brass. And the result is that you don't learn your judgment. And what this guy concluded, and this to me is a watchword, the Army needs chefs, but it's creating cooks. Most of the people who work in most roles, we need chefs. And what we're doing is hiring or forcing people to be cooks. Folks who can follow specific instructions, recipes, but have no sense of the whole, so that when a novel situation arises, they know how to adapt. It's easier to manage people who are cooks than it is to manage people who are chefs. Everything's more predictable, but you're settling for mediocre results rather than excellent results. And I think we have slid into this without fully appreciating what we've been taking away from people. And you're not just taking away their ability to do their work excellently, you're also taking away a source of satisfaction. This is a novel problem. I saw it, I recognized it, and I came up with a solution. Pat myself on the back. This is a good day's work that I did.
Can you describe the concept of incomplete contracts?
Sure. It is an old idea, and it speaks direct, as you obviously knew because you asked the question, it speaks directly to this. When you contract to do a job, it's impossible to specify all of the things that your employer is expecting of you. Your employer is expecting you to pay attention, to be diligent, to call someone if there seems to be something wrong in the production process, to get help when help is needed, to talk civilly and respectfully to your customers. I mean, there's a huge, the Yiddish word for this is be a mensch. Be a decent person in the workplace. Take your responsibilities seriously, take your customers and clients seriously, and so on and so on and so on. And if you listed all of the things that it took to be a mensch, you'd be writing things down for a very long time, because what it takes to be a mensch depends on the circumstances that you're in. So all contracts are incomplete. Certain things are specified, but a lot is left unspecified. And it's left unspecified because we take it for granted that the people we're contracting with want to be decent people. There are certain things that don't need to be said. And then along comes somebody who will simply honor the contract. No more, not one thing more. And because of that, you learn by watching how this person operates just how much was not in the contract, the agreement that you entered into with the employee. Because you finally encountered somebody who will only do what's explicitly stated in the contract. It has struck me that a lot of the criticisms of Trump as president have to do with this violation of a contract that has always been implicit. There can be policy differences, left versus right. Above and beyond that, here we had somebody who was willing to do absolutely anything he could get away with. And however much we disliked past presidents, they didn't seem to be guilty of that. They were trying to do the job, and they just had the wrong idea from our point of view about what doing the job should entail. And this guy was just a gangster, a full-on gangster. And if you started to write down all of the things that need to be in the contract that the president signs when he takes the oath of office, you'd be dead before you finish the list. And we came to see this because he violated each and every one of them, bit by bit. And we go, oh my God, look at all we've been taking for granted for all these years. And then the question is, can we write this into our legal statutory framework? And the answer is no, you can't.
I never really thought about that before. So first of all, it's interesting. I'm doing sort of this transitive analysis here. First of all, Mensches and chefs, very similar, which is that it's bigger than the simple cook, deliver the food. And also not a finding that Trump is not a mensch.
You did know that.
I knew that, yeah. And this is a finding which I really hadn't thought about, which is my first thought is we need to take the norms of democracy and we need to turn them into rules. That's absolutely my first thought.
Yeah.
And I hadn't thought that probably wouldn't work.
Again, rules are insurance policies against disaster. If you are facing disaster, figuring out what rules to add, it's not a bad way to triage an incredibly treacherous situation. But the notion that you can ever solve the problem if you have just the right rules is fantasy. And by the way, the same thing is true with incentives. People who rely on rules and incentives to get the kind of work they want out of the workforce thinks that there's a way to design incentives that are magic bullets and will get you exactly what you want. Employees are incredibly skilled at figuring out how to game any incentive structure you come up with. And the result is that what you get will be an approximation of what you want, but nothing near as close to what you want as if people simply wanted to do the right thing because it's the right thing. Incentives are a weak substitute for that. Another thing that Pfeffer says in the same book, The Human Equation, very, very important insight, I think. Most of us, when we're hiring, ask whether this person has the chops to do the job, technical skills. He says this is a mistake. Why is it a mistake? Because we probably know how to teach those skills. So his view is you should hire for attributes that you don't know how to teach, and then teach the attributes you do know how to teach. And this is very counterintuitive because if you do that, the people you hire will add no value to the organization until they actually get the skills. And then you would expect they will add enormous value because they're Mensches, because they're good people, because they're, dedicated. We don't know how to create Mensches. We try, right? Every time we have a child, it is a hope that this child will grow up to be a Mensch. If it were easy to do that, if we could stamp them out like we stamp out cars, it'd be a better world. We don't know how to teach that. We do know how to teach people to code. We do know how to teach people to do double entry bookkeeping. And we focus on the things that we shouldn't be focused on. Now, the problem, of course, is the things you don't know how to teach are also things that's not easy to measure. So when you're looking for Mensches, you may get it wrong. I mean, you will get it wrong. There's no question about it. You will be fooled more than once. But at least with that as your objective in hiring, you're going to end up hiring an entirely different set of people than if you're just looking at the specific skills that this job needs to fill a hole in the organization. This is a lesson that speaks both to the limits of rules and to the limits of incentives.
I had never heard that before, and that, I think, is an incredible insight. Hire for what can't be taught, and darn it, it probably can't be measured.
I think it's easier to measure these things, though it's going to be errorful. It is easier to measure these things than it is to teach them.
That's true. It reminds me a little bit of Socrates' dialogue, Can Virtue Be Taught? And his conclusion was, no. If you have to teach it, it's not virtue, was his point. Because if people learn to do it through teaching, it's not for the right reasons, essentially.
Well, but it can be. You just need to be teaching the right way. This is, look, when we socialize our kids, this is the objective. We want them to be happy. We want them to be successful, of course. And we want them to be decent human beings in the world. We don't want them to grow up to be Putin or Trump. We want them to add value to the world in some way. And we think that if they simply watch us, paragons of virtue that we all are, they will automatically become the kind of people that we want. We way overestimate how wonderful we are. And B, we way overestimate how much control we have over what our kids turn out to be. So it's as easy to create virtuous employees as it is to create virtuous children. It's the hardest job there is.
I think that's very fascinating. I interviewed at a company once that tried to interview for values. It was a deep interview. It was a fascinating interview. It was nothing like anything I've ever interviewed before. What they would say is they'd say, so tell me about your career. And then they'd say, why'd you make that decision? And they'd say, why? And eventually you got to, well, my father was, eventually it dug all the way down to like something in your upbringing it was a really interesting interview.
Yep. And, to my way of thinking, this is evidence that they're looking for the right stuff, but no evidence that they know how to find it. It's really hard.
Right.
These are hard things to suss out. And of course, once it becomes clear, say that Google is hiring for these attributes it doesn't know how to train, people will try to figure out how to game it. What answers do I need to give so that I will give the impression that I actually care about the welfare of other people, even though I couldn't care less.
So I have another question about why we work, and then I have a question that I think is a crossover between why we work and the paradox of choice, the crossover question. How has why we work been received? And what I'm probing here for is, who likes it? Do you see people doing stuff with it? You might not be able to see it, by the way. I mean, just because you can't perceive them doing it doesn't mean that they're not doing it. I'm an example. But yeah, so what do you see out there?
Nothing. I've got no indication, virtually no indication, that book has had any impact on anybody. Now, it should be said that with the exception of the paradox of choice, that has been my experience. I've written a half a dozen books for non-professional audiences in my career. Some predate you even knowing who I was. And all of them, with the single exception of the paradox of choice, landed with a thud. Now, I don't doubt that each of them has had an impact on somebody, but I have no evidence that anything I have written, except for the paradox of choice, has had anything like a broad enough influence that at least it's changing the questions that people ask. I was really optimistic about why we work. TED is a great platform. I talked about it at TED. I had a reputation when this book came out. Unlike my earlier books, people knew who I was. But if it's had an impact, I can't tell you what that impact has been.
I'll tell you a couple of things about that. First of all, why we work is passed around among my friends. So in the circles that I run in, we talk about it, we share it. And guess what? We're actually the people who are in a position to make a difference about it.
And that's why I have some optimism, because I've been teaching MBA students at Berkeley for 5 years now. And when I tell them, the course is called Work, Wisdom, and Happiness. And I say, listen, I don't really care about how happy your life is. All things equal, I'd rather that you have happy lives than not. But the reason I'm teaching this class is that you're going to be running organizations. And I want you to adopt policies that will enable all of the people you employ to get some satisfaction out of their work life. So it is their happiness that this course is designed to foster, not yours. And yours will just be a byproduct. But the fact that I'm teaching 70, 80 MBA students who are going to go on into positions of significance going forward encourages me that the book will have an impact, because a lot of what I do in the course is a playing out of the arguments that I make in the book. That may matter. And I agree with you. If you can manage to get the right set of people thinking about these issues, they can have a big impact without anyone ever tying it back to anything that you have done. And that would be fine.
And I'll tell you what, by the way, it's the hard thing about publishing books like that, because the people who that book needs to change does not make a market for a successful book. There's not enough of those people, right? But I'll tell you what's encouraging about what you just said is that the fact that you're teaching this in an MBA course, because I essentially think that MBAs are establishing an incomplete contract for CEOs, which is the incomplete contract is, here's what your job is, and we're going to simplify it down to something that is legible to you as a CEO so that you can make sense of your world. But we're not going to include the true complexity of the system that you need to manage, which includes this deeper truth about who works for your company.
Yeah. Well, look, I think the feedback I get from the MBA students is, of course, an elective. There's enormous self-selection who takes it. But I've gotten comments from some students over the years that say, this should be a required course of every first-year MBA student. There's one course that every one of us should take. This is it. And that makes me feel fantastic. But that's not what everybody says. It's what some people say. And I agree. I think that this really ought to open people's eyes. And, it's interesting here, Pfeffer, too. One of the things he finds unfortunate about the way in which enterprise has evolved is that there is too much control by people from finance, first of all, rather than people who actually know how to produce the product, or service, and too much control by people with training and with MBA training. And the reason he thinks that's a disaster is not that there's something evil about MBA training per se, but they're getting the wrong training. They're being taught to be very good at doing the wrong things. So you'd rather they were less skilled and tried to do the right thing.
In part because the definition of a successful company is determined by finance.
Yep. No, it is.
Right? To some extent. One of the challenges, me working inside a company, is that spreadsheets are very compelling.
Yep.
And they're very visible. And you can actually take a spreadsheet and you can turn it into a chart. And then once it's a chart, it's even more compelling. And so the truth is that the simplicity of the data around finance makes it a very compelling signal. And the complexity of the information that you get around other things is much harder to perceive.
It isn't just the simplicity, it's the precision.
False, yeah.
Well, I think it's almost certainly false precision, but you can't plot a point unless there's a value. So you are assigning a specific value and then putting it on the damn chart. And let me just say, there's a lot of concern, reasonable concern in organizations that there are these insidious forms of bias in the way we evaluate one another that no one knows how to get rid of. We want to worry about fit when we hire a new person. Now, what does that mean to most of us? What it means to most of us is we want to hire somebody who's just like us. And you know what happens when you do that? If you call it fit, especially because that seems more neutral, is you end up just replicating yourself and doing nothing to enhance diversity. So, and you want people to be treated fairly. You don't want to, give a leg up to some people rather than others. And particularly if you're making decisions about who to give the leg up to on the basis of illegitimate considerations. And so how do you protect against this so deeply human tendency to value people who are like us and without evil intent, committing bias left, right, and center? One answer is you rely on objective measures as a way of ensuring that you're being fair. And now when you make a negative judgment about somebody, you can point to the spreadsheet cell or the chart and explain why this person didn't get a bonus or this person is actually being relieved of responsibilities or whatever. And you can point to the same chart that depicts the data for other people doing essentially the same job. Look how much worse you're doing at this than other people who are doing the same thing. We just can't keep you. And this is a real problem. So the appeal of the data is not only that it gives us a sense of precision that is unjustified, but also that it is an antidote to all kinds of bias that creep in when we are much more informal in the way in which we evaluate people and processes. And that's a good thing. And I'm not even willing to argue that we should stop doing this, because it's a very good thing to do whatever we can to root this sort of bias out. But there's a price that we pay. And I think people act as if there is no price. And if we acknowledge that the price of this false precision is significant, we might actually ask ourselves whether there are ways we can get the benefits of this kind of search for metrics without paying quite so high a price. If you think there's no price, then it doesn't even occur to you to look for another way of doing it.
I am not sure it's clear that those objective measures can be applied objectively? That's a real open challenge, right? Which is now you've essentially formed another kind of incomplete contract.
It's still progress, even if they can't be applied objectively. Somebody who wants to challenge you can point to the criteria that you said you were using in making a decision and argue with you. That's not right, because if you had been using those criteria and no others, you would not have made that decision, and force you to acknowledge an imperfection in your assessment that you might otherwise not. So it does not solve the problem, but it might be a useful step in solving the problem, assuming that we've got people of goodwill who are trying to get better at these really hard things they have to do every day.
I'm going to switch to a new question. I believe that work is a product that companies sell to employees. And I believe that the value of that product is not exclusively in the pay. I believe that there's all these attributes of that product that we're selling that actually people want. And so what I've realized is that there's a marketplace inside the company for allocating work. If I really understand what you want, I'm going to be able to allocate that work more effectively to you, because it's the kind of work that you want to buy from my company. And there's all these different kinds of work. And if I can allocate it better, great. So one of my thoughts is, well, I can only do so well at that. Why don't I open up a marketplace and let people choose? So I'm going to give people as much choice as possible about what work they get. Uh-oh, I've just hit the paradox of choice. So I think we're okay in this case, because the truth is I can't give that many choices. I don't have complete freedom to give people absolutely anything. And so generally it's down to like 3 different choices. Some projects are coming up, I can allocate them. But I do think that there's a little bit of a conflict between providing autonomy, which can mean choice, which can lead to the fact that the more choices there are, the less we value each.
So it's an interesting problem. Here's my take on it. You are already challenging employees by even suggesting that you are a company that is selling work and they are buying the work. That is so mind-blowingly different from the way people think that they're going to almost certainly be disoriented going in. You're shaking them up from the get-go, and then you offer a cafeteria. And I think the combination of encouraging them to think in this fundamentally different way, and this is not a criticism, it's just to try to get you to appreciate how unsettling it can be to think of yourself as a customer, to think as a prospective employee, to think of him or herself as a customer. And then you have this panoply of possibilities. So I do think that you want to pay attention to how big that panoply is. And the reason is not just that you'll find people paralyzed, which is a lot of what the paradox of choice talks about. But even if they manage not to be paralyzed and they choose, they're going to end up less satisfied with what they've chosen because they're spending their time thinking about the alternatives that might have been better. What you need is choice, autonomy within constraint. And the question is, which constraints, how many of them? My book ends, and my talks usually end with a cartoon that I show from the New Yorker of a simple goldfish bowl. And there's a parent fish and a baby fish. And the caption reads, "You can be anything you want to be, no limits." And of course, the first reaction is, boy, that stupid parent has no idea what the world is like outside that fishbowl. This is not no limits, right? There's like nothing going on in this fishbowl. The second reaction that not everybody has, but I had, is that this parent fish is onto something. Because what this fishbowl does is it provides a kind of security within which the fish can live an appropriate life for a fish. And if you shattered that fishbowl, life would be unmanageable for that fish. If you liberated the fish, that would be the end. And so the question in my mind is, what needs to be in the human fishbowl? And the notion that you can shatter the fishbowl and in that way enhance freedom and well-being is just completely misguided. It is not easy to figure out what needs to go in the human fishbowl. It is not easy for you to figure out which choices to offer prospective employees and which constraints to impose. It's the sort of thing that you're likely to get wrong. But if your eyes are open, you will get better and better establishing the kinds of constraints that enable people to make choices and feel good about them. But it's a huge, huge mistake to think that what you really want is to create at your company or in society at large, a shattered fishbowl. You can make your job whatever you want your job to be. That's how we operate here. That's how we roll. You can make your job anything you want it to be. You're talented, you mean well, you're a good person, be fruitful, and help the company.
I can see that. And a part of what comes to mind for me is the idea, because again, I'm thinking about work as a product. And I say people buy, but I actually mean subscribe to, which is that when you sell products, you generally have a product line. And the product line doesn't give you every option on the planet. There's product A, product B, product C. You configure those products maybe. But a part of the reason for that is that if I offered you 50 kinds of Teslas, you wouldn't be as happy with any one of them. But I'm going to offer you 3 models. Big chunky differences between those models. You pick one, you're right in the center of what you care about. The other things exclude the other things. So I realized recently, I was talking to a colleague of mine who said he was an immigrant to technology. He says, my family's blue collar from Michigan, and I now work in a high-tech company, and I feel like I see the world differently because I'm from a different culture. And I realized that I'm an immigrant to business because I come from a family of academics. And so I see work differently. It also means that I can be sometimes not accepted in business environments. Are you an immigrant to academia from business?
Well, I mean, I guess so. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. All of my cohort, all of my cousins except one got college degrees, but none of our parents went to college. So they were scrambling to make a living. Almost all of them worked in the garment industry in New York. And so, yes, my native language is the language of business. My mother was a partner in a small manufacturing company, and I watched the struggles that she went through to keep the company afloat. It went bankrupt several times and changed its name. And I could tell by whether we had Sunday dinner in a diner or in a white tablecloth restaurant, I could tell how business was going without ever asking her, because you didn't actually talk about things like that. So yes, that was my background. So my first language, to use a Robert Bella phrase, my first language is the language of business. We didn't really talk that language much because I don't think anyone in my family was particularly proud of what they actually did. They were proud that they were able to provide for their families, but not particularly proud of what they were doing to provide for their families.
Do you think that has informed your work?
Well, I guess I have seen at firsthand how thoroughly oppressive and unpleasant work is for so many people. Maybe that has informed the trajectory of my work. I saw very little evidence that people were being well used in the workplace.
It's funny because one of the examples you used when you talked about not good work was pressing a shirt.
Yeah. My first summer job was working in a clothing factory. And I had no skills. So what my job was to take work from one station and bring it to another. And more specifically, I was taking pairs of slacks that had been returned and repaired, I guess, over to the pressers who would repress them so that they could go back out, be sold again. For big clothing manufacturer. This was just one of many factories. The pressers were working by the piece. So they just wanted as much work as possible. In their area with these gigantic pressing machines, it was summertime, must have been 140 degrees. It was inhuman. And they're all in their undershirts and sweating like pigs. And they just want more work, more work, more work, because they're there to provide for their families, nothing else. That's why they're there. But I got to see at firsthand that people are really not being treated well by their employers. There was no reason for their work to be this way.
Actually, that's something that I have come across in a couple of my careers. So the way I think about it is that the design of work is neglected. It's neglected because we think it doesn't matter very much.
Right.
And what I've learned is that neglect is a very, very close neighbor to abuse. I worked in criminal defense for a little while. I was a criminal defense investigator, and I found that the people who were charged with the most serious crimes, capital crimes, had not been abused. They've been neglected. So neglecting the needs of some category of people, and I will tell you that the profession that I learned in working in business was that, in fact, if you couldn't prove that something was going to result in ROI, that you didn't invest in it. And that meant that you could neglect a category of people.
No, that's exactly right. And, look, it's even worse than that, I think, because you don't want to be held hostage by your workforce. It's a feature, not a bug, to create a workplace process where people are interchangeable. I come into your office and I make a demand and you say, oh, well, have a good life. I can replace you in a heartbeat. And the last thing you want is people who are irreplaceable. Now, you can't avoid that completely, but there's an awful lot of dumbing down, de-skilling of work that will enable you to make more and more of your employees interchangeable parts. That's a good thing from the point of view of ROI, because now when employees make demands, you can just give them the finger and tell them to get lost. So again, I don't think this is an accident. I think the desire for control on the part of managers has a lot to do with the de-skilling of work. God forbid you tell me you figure out how to do this job, because then you, the manager, become superfluous. If I don't need you looking over my shoulder, then maybe the company doesn't need you at all. So the coin of the realm, I think, in hierarchical organizations, the coin of the realm is not coin, it's control. And managers want to control the people they manage. And one way to do that is to have them engaged in routinized activities, going through lists of instructions that you hand them. So these are hard things to change. It takes a lot of confidence on the part of managers to trust their people they manage. So it's worse than neglect, I would say.
Yeah. I'm going to explore that question of control in later interviews. One of the people I'm interviewing later is James C. Scott, fingers crossed, who's a political scientist. He started off as an anthropologist. He's written books called Seeing Like a State. You may know that book, which is about how the state needs to create legibility in the populace and then enforces that simplicity in ways that are detrimental to the world. And I think that some of that is control, and I want to explore that.
But there's also, in the case of a state, let me just say, legitimacy. And you can't really, I don't think, establish and preserve legitimacy with claims that you meant well. Things didn't work out, but I meant well. Trust me. You really need to be able to point to procedures, control mechanisms, evaluation mechanisms that assure people who are scrutinizing you will have something to scrutinize. So there's a kind of accountability that states are supposed to have that high-level management doesn't have to have. So it's harder to be a state than it is to be a company.
That's a really interesting point. Closing question.
Yeah.
I ask everybody the question I ask everybody who works, which is, what job do you hire your work to do for you?
This is terrible. I think more than anything, Why We Work is a book that characterizes what makes work, what has made work good for me, sort of exporting my set of values to the workforce at large. I think we're all to some degree guilty of doing something like this, but the things I've been an academic my whole life, went straight from college to graduate school and straight from graduate school to a job. As a 25-year-old, I was an assistant professor at a very selective liberal arts college. I stayed there for 45 years. So I sort of found heaven, and I was smart. I lucked into finding heaven, but I was smart enough at least to appreciate it when I found it. So I'll pat myself on the back for not leaving. I don't pat myself on the back for finding in the first place. That was just good fortune. So I never had to do the same thing twice. I taught the same course year after year after year after year, but I was completely free to change what the content was and how I taught it. This is not to say that I tore up everything and started from scratch every year, but I could. And people weren't looking over my shoulder. I was evaluated for tenure after year 6, and basically that was the end of the evaluations. If students had stopped coming to my classes, it would have been kind of obvious that something was wrong. But I managed to be successful enough, popular enough, entertaining enough that never happened. So within incredibly broad parameters, I was free to do what I thought I should be doing in the service of educating students and, in my writing, educating the larger community. Who could ask for more than that? The students were enthusiastic. They wanted to be educated. There were no discipline issues. It's not like teaching third grade or junior high school or community college. People were there because they wanted to be there. Virtually none of the courses I taught were required. So not only did people want to be in the school, they wanted to be in my course. I just lucked into the best possible circumstance. And because it was a small college, I got to interact with people in other disciplines in a way that was easy. And in large universities, that's hard. It's not impossible, but you have these silos. You have to really make an effort to get to know people in adjacent disciplines that ought to be talking to each other, but mostly aren't. Well, it was just routine to have all the social scientists talking to one another in a place like Swarthmore. I didn't have to do anything but walk across the campus. It was just natural. And I didn't appreciate how important any of these things were to me when I started, but I quickly came to see how important these things were, these attributes of the job were. So I hired myself into the perfect job without knowing it.
I'll tell you, there's a couple things in there. First of all, many academics I talk to, many people who work for universities do not have that experience. And in particular, the students, they are not happy with the students they have because the students they have are not interested in the subject, are more careerist, right? They're not interested. It's just a pathway to something else.
Well, let me just say 45 years, 50 years ago now, it was a different time. 50 years ago, if you got into a school like Swarthmore, your future was guaranteed as long as you didn't commit a felony. And the result is that people were not careerists because they just took it for granted that their careers would take care of themselves. And I don't think anyone thinks that anymore. So it's a different time.
Yes. Also, I suspect that some schools, so let's follow along with my idea that work is a product. If work is a product that we sell, who's manufacturing that product? Well, to some extent, there's a supply chain of work that comes in from your customer, from the normal customer of a business. And picking the right customer makes it so that you have a supply chain of the kind of work that your workforce wants to consume. Well, universities that bring in the kind of students that really want to learn and who are passionate about the subject and are Swarthmore used to do that. Or maybe it still does, but I mean, it did then because once you got into Swarthmore, you were free to do that. So you had a good supply chain of work in terms of your students.
Yep.
And I've seen some universities, for instance, the University of Chicago, that their recruitment when my kids were applying was they sent out puzzles. It was a series of puzzles of brain teasers that potential applicants had to solve. And I think that they probably got a very interesting set of students that way, the supply chain.
Well, that is interesting. And the other thing is that is maybe worth mentioning. Some years ago, there's a saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Hillary Clinton wrote a book called It Takes a Village. The main insight in that statement, that truism, is that raising up families is complicated. We can't do it on our own. It takes community support, institutional support, neighbors, churches, clubs, what have you. And we all rely on these things to help us. But there's another side to this. It's not simply that it takes a village. It is a fact that villages raise children, whether you want them to or not. You can't seal your kids off from the culture in which they grow. And so if you're raising your kids in Palo Alto and everybody there is insanely competitive, then there's really not much you're going to be able to do as a parent to shut that down. And it's going to be catastrophic, certainly bad, and maybe even catastrophic. You're giving your kids the world on a silver platter, and they're miserable because all they're doing every minute of every day is asking how they stack up against their peers. And by the time they finish, by the time they get into college, I think getting into college is the goal line instead of the starting line. That's the worst thing in the world. You're not at fault, except that you chose to live in Palo Alto. If you'd lived somewhere else, it would have been a different village raising your child. You would have had different problems. But there you have this problem. And so there's a sense in which Swarthmore, without changing anything it did in the time that I was there, became a different place because it was living in a different village than it was in 1970, where it could be incredibly cavalier about fostering the kind of attitude it wanted in students because they came in with that attitude. They were incredibly privileged and entitled, and they just took it for granted that they'd be successful. And the only question was, successful at what? And the world changed, and Swarthmore suddenly had to figure out what, if anything, it could do to adjust living in a very different village. I think this is a problem when you work for a tech company and you think incentives are vastly overvalued and destructive, but you also know that all your competition for employees is going to use them. And unless you at least bow in the direction of the coin of the realm, you're not going to be able to hire or keep the people you want to hire and keep. And so you decide that you'll try to sand the edges a little smoother and take the worst aspects of this incentive structure out of your particular workplace. But you can't pretend that you get to make up the rules uninfluenced by what's going on outside. And if Google can't do it, nobody can do it. And I don't think Google can do it. And maybe Google could do it when it started. It sure as hell can't do it anymore. And so that's just a fact of life, I think, that has changed. So I lucked into not only the perfect job, but it was the perfect job because I entered the field at the perfect time. And, if I entered the field now, I would probably not get anything like the satisfaction out of the work I have done that I have over the 50 years I've been doing it. It's a different job.
Thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Well, I feel the same way. Really has felt like it's just a terrific conversation. You ask great questions. You're very thoughtful, and I appreciate it.
I think there's somebody that you've mentioned about 4 times who I should see if they're available to interview, which is Pfeffer.
Yes. And unlike, I'm an amateur, this is what he's been doing for his whole career. And, I have learned a huge amount from what he's written.
Actually, you do something I just want to say that I think is so important. And I said this in the write-up, which is there's a billion loose studies out there in the world. And I don't know methodologically which are good and which are bad. And I don't have time to figure it out. And I don't have time to go through all of them. And what you do is in your books is you take a collection of those and you weave the most important ones into coherent narrative so that people like me can consume them. And I can think of a couple of writers who do that. I think Steven Pinker does that with cognitive science. I think Malcolm Gladwell does that to some extent. But I really thank you because it really is. It's a super, super important thing to do.
Well, you're very kind. That is, of course, what I try to do. That's my objective, is to make this a manageable task for the people who read the book. It would not be manageable to leave you on your own. As people discover, I don't know if you've had this experience, you get an ailment and it's a pain in the ass to go to the doctor. So you're going to kind of figure this out on your own by going online. And, you and I are sophisticated enough. And with my wife's help, she's a neuroscientist, you can find your way to the trustworthy websites. You haven't solved the problem. You've just solved the easiest parts of the problem to solve. Now you have to read what's on them and figure out what the hell these things are saying and how important they are. And it's like, oh, God, give me back my doctor. I can't do this. It's really hard. And so I try to be like a good website. This is what you need to know, and here's why. But there's a tightrope you walk. Daniel Kahneman is a pretty good friend of mine. And when he wrote this hugely successful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he already was a Nobel Prize winner. So he had this unbelievable reputation. And he wanted to write a book that would simultaneously be accessible and useful to people like you,
and teach his colleagues something, because he had an enormous reputation to lose. I didn't have that. Nobody knew who I was when I started writing these kinds of books. He had an enormous reputation to lose, and he didn't want to lose it. And he got a big advance, and so he had to write. He couldn't just write a book for his colleagues, because that would never justify the advance. So he had to find some way to write a book like Malcolm Gladwell's and Pinker's, and also educate for his colleagues. And he tortured himself. He stopped 3 times, gave it up, said, I can't do this. It's not possible. And he kept on getting pushed, try again. And the result was hugely successful. I don't think he succeeded fully in writing a book that people who don't already know a fair amount will actually read from start to finish. There's more in there than needs to be. But I can see why. It's a very, very hard compromise that you make between the judgmental eyes of your peers and the hungry eyes of your intended readers. And it's really hard to hit the sweet spot with both of those groups. Anyway, this has been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much for taking the time. We've talked for a long time, almost 2 hours. Not only do I think it's going to be interesting, I learned stuff.
As did I. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.